Salutations, everybody. Saludos a todos. My name is Emmanuel Morales, also known as Manny, and my artist name is CA. I'll be presenting to you on the topic of lowriding, our culture, our identity. So I'm going to be doing this through the PowerPoint, in the PowerPoint format. But just to give you a heads up, I'm also going to be simultaneously recording the audio version of this for my podcast, the book, The Endless Pursuit of Knowledge, which is available on most major podcast apps or platforms, including Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. And the visual version of it is going to be available on my YouTube channel, so keep an eye out for that. I'll make sure to document the links, to add the links to each post that I do. That way you can easily find the alternate version of it. And so to get things started, I want to focus today on, or start by focusing on the image that you see here, which is the cover of my PowerPoint presentation. This image is really important to me for a lot of reasons, but I'm going to break it down to you because if you are listening in on the audio version of the podcast, you're not going to be able to see it right away. So hopefully you'll be able to hit the link and go check it out. But the images of a 1993 Cadillac Fleetwood, and this is my brother's car, and it's parked up against the curb at the JC, Santa Rosa Junior College, in that roundabout or that horseshoe area. And so the reason that this is really important to me is because if you know the history of lowriding here in Sonoma County, here in Santa Rosa specifically, then you also know that lowriding was outlawed, lowriding was frowned upon, and there were a lot of policies around it and strategies that the police used to try to deter people from being out lowriding. Santa Rosa Junior College is on Mendocino Avenue, and Mendocino Avenue here in Santa Rosa was the main spot where people would go cruising. It has a long history, but I got to see it. I got to experience it in the late 90s and early 2000s as the police were starting to crack down and, like I said, use different strategies to try to deter people from doing it, from being out and about, from getting together. So for this car to be sitting in front of the JC, for me to be able to take this picture, it's important because, when people would be out there cruising, people would get pulled over for the music, for how loud the music was, for the height of the car, for using hydraulics, for cruising too slow. People would get ticketed. Some cars even got impounded. And like I said, it was all a strategy to try to keep people away. So to kind of speed up a little bit and bring it up to date, this picture was taken a couple years ago. My brother let me borrow the car to bring it to the Mecha Youth Conference. And so I've been privileged to organize and collaborate with these student organizations to bring on lowriders to the campus. And one thing to have several cars parked on campus around the water fountain in front of the library, between that and the bookstore, was important for me, right? It's symbolic. And to have that privilege, to have that opportunity to be able to collaborate with the student groups makes it that much more powerful, because this is all done in an effort to try to reverse that mentality or that stereotype of a lowrider as gang involved or gang associated, to convert it into embracing the car culture, embracing the art form, embracing the lifestyle, and letting that be part of the higher learning environment. It's pretty special to me. So, I'm going to break down some of the things that you see right off the bat. The lowrider rims, also known as spokes. In the wheel well, you see the suspension with some chrome, as well as the frame with some patterns and pinstripe on it. Throughout the car, you also see more patterns, more pinstriping, gold leafing, the chrome trim, the chrome bumper, and the Castle Grill in the front, right? And it's sitting in that roundabout or that horseshoe in front of the JC. And like I said, we've even had the opportunity to have the car on campus, literally on the bricks there. And so we're going to go into the presentation, and I'm going to break it down into several eras, or phases, if you want to refer to it that way. And we're going to start with the origins of the car culture and the Chicano culture around it. And so I'm going to bring it back to the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. And so it begins in the southwest states of the United States. That is California, Arizona, Nuevo Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Nevada, and a couple other states that had a large Mexican American population. All right. So back then, I want to point out that there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of racism, a lot of oppression, and it was all or mostly aimed at the Mexican American and indigenous community, the Native American community here. And, they were deemed second-class citizens. Segregation was very much part of the politics and the societal kind of construct of the Southwest. Also in the 1930s, as a result of the Great Depression and the economic downfall, Mexican Americans were scapegoated as being the blame for the economic downfall. And so there was a policy in place that allowed the government to create a mass deportation program called the Repatriation Act of the 1930s. And it's important, if you want to look into it, kind of get some of the context around it. There is a movie that I feel like does a really good job of depicting that what was happening, the struggles, both civically and culturally, and that's Mi Familia. So if you get a chance to check it out, there's several actors, well-known actors now, who were part of that film. But I feel like in general, it does a really good job of depicting what that was like. I want to talk about some of the prevalent terms, identity terms that were used during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. One of them was being Mexican. Mexican referred to people born in Mexico of Mexican nationality or Mexican descent. Also Mexican American, and that referred to people of Mexican descent but born in the United States. During that time, there was also the term being used as Chicano, Chicana, and that was more of a derogatory term. That was to stereotype, that was to degrade Mexicans and to shame them for their roots. The term Pachuco, Pachuca also became popular in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It referred to the Mexican American youth who would dress in suits, which was a style that was inspired by the African American community of the East Coast of the northern states, New York, and also the Midwest area, where they would go to clubs to play blues and jazz and dressed in suits or those big coats, kind of a suit style with the pants that were creased, kind of high-waisted, but it looked nice. It was a nice way to present yourself. I also want to point out that during those times, not everyone had the ability or the economic means to have a lot of clothes or have a lot of suits. So for the youth, it became a thing of pride to be able to take care of their clothes, to present themselves well, to iron, and to have it all done up and put away when they weren't wearing it. So it became part of the Chicano culture, part of the Pachuco culture, which was as a result of it resulted as a subculture from the African American culture, right? I also want to talk about what was labeled as the Susu riots in 1943. This was an incident of violence that originated in the streets of Los Angeles as Navy men came home on break from the war, were out at the bars. There was an altercation that occurred that led to mass violence against Pachuco youth, or youth, dressed in their attire. So the focus of the violence was aimed at brown youth, essentially. And so even though the Navy men, who were mostly of white or Anglo descent, even though they initiated or instigated the violence, it was still labeled as the Susu riots as a way to scapegoat the blame onto the brown youth. And it's really important to consider that. Also to study it, look into it if you can. I also want to talk about the car culture at the time. It was mostly Chevys that were being customized. The cars were usually family cars. The style developed around it was all about being low and slow, which meant lowering the rear end of the car to give it sort of this mean look as it cruised down the street. And slow just basically meant that you were cruising out and about, not in a rush, but just kind of taking it slow. So it became about style. It became about looks. And counter to that, or the opposite car culture to that at the time, was the hot rods, which was mostly Fords that were customized. Their engines were customized. The focus was on speed and aerodynamics, which is why they lowered the front end. And so the car culture, the Chicano car culture, was then developed as a counterculture in that sense. Like I said, it was family cars, so there wasn't a whole lot of modifications that they could do to it, at least permanently. So in order to lower it in the back, sometimes they would use bricks or sandbags or concrete bags in order to temporarily lower the car from the back. And then as soon as they would go home and drop it off to their parents, they would take out those bags or the bricks and get it back to stock height or factory height. So it was difficult to modify the suspensions at that time. I also want to highlight and embrace that at the core of the culture during those times, values were really important, and the values centered around family, respect, and honor were one of the main ones, right? And I highlight that because a lot of the times, due to stereotypes and prejudices, we tend to criminalize or easily alienate those who at the core of themselves and their beliefs have respectable values. All right, so some of the pictures that you see in this slide, I'll just kind of break it down. There's some youngsters, some youth dressed in their Chicano attire. Also the Pachucas in their Pachuco attire, I'm sorry. Also the Pachucas down at the bottom right. On the bottom left, there's a police officer kind of inspecting. Looks like he might have a Pachuco detained. And the top right is an image from the time of the Susu riots, and that is of a youth that has his clothes stripped, was thrown out on the pavement or the sidewalk as a way to shame them for their roots, shame them for their culture, and ultimately allow that discrimination to persist. All right, going on to the next slide. This era I consider La Causa. This is the 1960s and 70s in the United States. And as history has taught us, my apologies, I took a quick drink. As history has taught us, this was the times, the era of the civil rights. And so the civil rights were centered around the treatment of African Americans in the United States, their ability to vote, to own property, and to desegregate our communities. And at the same time, Mexican Americans, and other communities of color organized to also fight for civil rights as well as student rights and labor rights. During this time, discrimination persisted, as did segregation. Police brutality and abuse of power came in all shapes and forms and sizes, from the police officers who patrolled the neighborhoods to the way that people in public office did things ethically and unethically in an effort to discriminate against others, as well as the businesses and how they would reject customers based on their skin color or language that they spoke. But also during this time came the piece about organizing. And so a lot of community organizations came together to build and develop a sense of security in the communities, a sense of protection, a sense of guidance, with many organizations focusing on civil and labor rights. Also, during that time, many gangs started to form. The youth that were frustrated with the system, frustrated with the conditions that we're living in, began to unify and started to create some of the gangs that we know now. Unfortunately, due to the violence that has occurred over the last few decades. But also around that time, car clubs started to organize. So car builders began to form groups, and those groups, similar to the jacket clubs that existed in the 40s and 50s, these car groups developed or evolved into a car club with membership status, membership rights, and their ability to co-build or co-create the cars. Some of the established car clubs from the 60s and 70s were Imperial's Car Club, Technique's Car Club, Lifestyle Car Club, and Click. They're all Southern California based, the majority of them being LA, specifically LA based car clubs. And, in a future slide, we're going to talk about how they expanded and evolved to include more clubs, more chapters, and all that. Also, during the 1960s and 70s, you start to see the development or progression of car customization, the craftsmanship. You see the image of this 1964 Impala that is called Gypsy Rose. It's custom painted. All the roses on the car, they're all hand painted. This car now sits in the National Car Hall of Fame. Basically, I'm blanking on the name now, but it is now recognized as this national treasure. And it's a lowrider car. It's kind of cool to see that. And you also see other images, Brown Berets who organized at the same time that the Black Panthers were organizing, and a film that kind of captures, well, not kind of, but it does a really good job capturing that tight family mentality, as well as the Chicano culture and being part of that subculture, as well as the impacts of gang violence, is Boulevard Nights. So don't just take it for entertainment, but also as a way to kind of educate yourself. I highly suggest watching that movie. And so during this time of car craftsmanship, the full customization, the paint jobs, interiors, hydraulics start to be introduced. Hydraulics originally were all airplane parts that were being used to lower and raise the car, eventually getting it to a place where it could actually hop. Not huge hops, but it became competitive. Then once enough people started doing it, and so along with the craftsmanship evolving comes the introduction of car modification laws, and these were laws practiced by the police departments to deter people from cruising and from building cars that resemble lowriders. Also, just as the gangs were forming, the community organizations were forming, and and the the importance of lowriders as well as the attractiveness of lowriders started to grow. It started to include other minorities, other ethnic minorities, to become more multicultural. And so you start to see the African American community also start to develop um, to build their own cars and develop their car clubs. Moving on to the next era, this is what I call overcoming the warfare, to symbolize how lowriders continued to evolve, the culture continued to grow. And this was during the 1980s and 90s. So during this time, the evolution of traditional lowriders went from being primarily Chevys, bombs, trucks, and the big body cars to then including um, the mini trucks and Euros. Mini trucks like this Nissan depicted here on the picture had custom paint job, custom interior, gold plated everything. The bed cover that raised. Some of the trucks would have hydraulics in the bed so that the bed itself could be manipulated and turned and twisted. It would be called dancing the bed. And then you see the door that it opens non-conventionally. It opens in a way that is considered suicide. So basically, the hinges are on the opposite ends, and it opens towards the front rather than towards the back. And so, yeah, the car clubs began to expand nationally. So it went from just being a SoCal-based movement into creating several chapters throughout the United States. And then as a result of that, you start to see mainstream America incorporating lowriders more into music, movies, and magazines. Um, Lowriders then became closely associated with rap music or rap culture. Eazy being one of the first artists to feature lowriders, and then it became synonymous with the culture. You also have films like Boys in the Hood that had a lowrider kind of at the forefront of the film. And so then it became closely associated to street culture, to the violence that occurs in the community, but also in general just to the LA culture. And Lowrider Magazine hit an international level. It began distributing its magazine throughout the world, and so that kind of fueled the popularity of lowrider as a culture, not just a subculture at that point or a counterculture, but more of a mainstream culture. And so other nations began to buy into it and began to build their own. And I'll kind of talk about that in the next slide. Then you also have films like Blood In, Blood Out and several others that are depicting Chicano culture at the time, as it was being impacted by violence, and still civil rights issues, social issues and stuff like that. So really important to check out the what the film industry was depicting at the time. Some which I agree with, and other which is I feel like is a better representation. You kind of pick and choose what you want to watch. During this time also, there's anti-cruising laws. So just like in the 60s and 70s, there was anti-modification laws. In the 80s and 90s, it became more about anti-cruising laws. They couldn't control who was building lowriders, so instead they were going to control who was out cruising, who was out gathering. Some of the main boulevards or streets out in LA, Crenshaw Boulevard and other streets that became popular for lowriders. Along with that came anti-cruising laws that would try to deter people from being out. So that's where it became outlawed to be out driving around. Here locally on Mendocino Avenue, the police department used different strategies to try to deter people from being out there. Mendocino Avenue is a 4-lane road, 2 in each direction. And so one of the strategies they would use was to narrow it down to 2 lanes, therefore creating traffic congestion, and also making it easier to ticket people, to tow people's cars, impound them, and do all that as a way to try to, get people off the street, or catch them with loud music or using the hydraulics, things like that. So they try to discourage people from large gatherings and being out in the street. And so many of the people who live here in Sonoma County, in Santa Rosa, remember those times. And eventually it got to the point where the cruising had to move, and people had to organize it a little bit more, a little bit better. But still, the place to be is Mendocino Avenue, and now also Sebastopol Road, which is at the heart of the Rosan area, the Rosan district here in Santa Rosa. Aside from the anti-cruising laws, you also had gang violence getting national attention. So for the incidents that were occurring in some of the biggest cities in the United States, it was creating a stereotype and a burden to have gangs and gang activity in the cities. So then the government and police agencies started to organize gang injunctions, which was another way to deter people from being out, organizing, getting together as official gangs. A lot of it was done in what they felt was kind of a preventative approach, but what really turned into gang documentation. So documenting people as gang members, associates, or affiliates. Incarceration, it contributed to mass incarceration in our prison and jail systems. And it really took away from resources from the community. So nothing about it was proactive. If anything, it created more issues. And now our systems are overwhelmed with mass incarceration, with mass amounts of people being detained and labeled as gang members. All right, so I'm going to move on to our next slide. And this kind of brings it more up to speed to current date. I call this slide the here to stay, or this era here to stay, from Y2K till. And so from the 2000s up until now, the lowrider scene has seen a massive growth, massive progression. It has hit the international scene. Clubs are now established in different countries. It's not just Southern California based or nationally here in the States, but also at the international level. You see car clubs that are in Germany, car clubs that are in Japan, Mexico, South America, all over the place, that are branches of car clubs that were first established in California or in LA. And I feel like all this is part of the evolution of lowriders. And now it includes V-Class or motorcycles. So you see the picture of the motorcycle that the paint job resembles that of a lowrider. It has the white walls, the spoke rims. The seat is customized, made to resemble that of an interior of a car. And so you have that. You have other styles of cars that the paint jobs resemble, the rims might resemble, the interior or the sound systems might resemble that of a lowrider, of a traditional lowrider, but it has evolved to include other styles of cars, other styles of car cultures. Um, there's also new films that depict the lowrider scene or the Chicano culture in a better light, Pachuco culture in a better light. I feel like it's all in an effort to restore the image of the culture, to be more inclusive, and just to to undo the negative stereotypes that have been put in place. And the lowrider shows definitely hit the international scene. In the early 2000s, I started to see a lot of Midwest cities start to host their own lowrider shows at their own venues. And then from there, just kind of keeping up with Lowrider Magazine, seeing what was happening internationally. You also see other countries kind of get into it. So at the bottom right of the slide, you see folks of Japanese descent who are in a lot of ways dressed like Chicanos, dressed like Mexican Americans, and the tattoo style, the clothing, the cars that they own or they build closely resemble the traditional lowriders and Chicana lifestyle here in California. Um, I feel like at this point the customization has hit a new level. The car value has definitely increased. It went from family owned cars to cars that are valued upwards of 35, 40, 50, um, or even more thousands of dollars. And it goes from the traditional bomb truck or big body cars to the big bodies of the 1990s, as well as still those Euros are out there, the mini trucks are out there. And definitely the evolution of the hydraulic is now allowing cars to hit back bumper. That's what it's called. And to raise the front 12 to 16 feet above and have hopping competitions, sometimes to the point where the car flips and falls on its roof. Um, and so, it's obvious how that has increased or evolved. The paint jobs, definitely. There are a lot of great painters out there, pinstripers and muralists who have done work on cars and keep that art form as vivid as possible. The interiors, for sure, the different materials that are being used in the cars, the different styles. Some people keep it traditional. Some people like to incorporate more custom, and so you'll see that variety. All right. And so next, I'll talk a little bit about. Actually, I'll go back to the previous slide. In the center of the page, there is a PlayStation 2 lowrider game. I remember when my brother got that game for me, and all I would do is sit there and like build a car, customize it some, and then hop it. And it was a pretty simple game. But for me, the idea that this car culture became so mainstream to the point that it had a video game designed after it, I felt like that was the most symbolic thing that could happen. Right? It's being depicted in movies and music videos and things of that sort. But to have a video game, I felt like took it to the next level. And again, I felt like it all went back to the idea of restoring the image of a lowrider. So I'm gonna touch base on some of the identity terms that I brought up and break them down a little bit more. Um, so the identity and stereotypes. Sometimes that causes issues of self identity, um, of empowerment or esteem. but it's really important to acknowledge them and to learn about them. And I want to start with the term Mexica. That refers to the peoples of Central Mexico, also known as the Aztecs. And that civilization, how a lot of us um, are direct or through a long lineage of blood related to the Mexica people of Mexico. And that's also where the word for the country comes from, Mexico, derived from Mexica people. Mestizo, I want to also highlight that it was a derogatory term meant for people of mixed blood. It meant that you came from a European parent and an indigenous parent or bloodline, so you had a mixed blood, and it wasn't necessarily seen as a positive thing. It was part of the caste system that was in colonial Mexico, and so something to be conscious of and to look into. Mexicans, again, people that are born in Mexico of Mexican nationality or Mexican ancestry or heritage. Mexican Americans are also descendants of Mexicans, but born in the United States. And so the clear distinction is there that Mexicans are originally from Mexico, Mexican nationals, and Mexican Americans are folks born in the United States, but of Mexican heritage or descent. Also, the term Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, that term comes from people who are of Spanish-speaking descent, but have indigenous or African roots, and so it's inclusive of most folks from northern, central, and South America. And Hispanics is more associated with people who have a direct tie to Spain, direct bloodline to Spain, and are Spanish-speaking. Chicanos, Chicanas, Chicanx, that's another term that, like I said, at first was derogatory in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. In the 1960s, it became a term of empowerment. It was reappropriated to mean something positive for our community, especially for our youth who were fighting for civil rights, political, and student rights. And the term Chicanx now it's another evolution of the term, which is more inclusive of different gender identities, gender terms, and also maintaining that sense of gender neutrality. Pachucos and Pachucas, though, refers to the suitors. And from my understanding, the way that term came to be is that it referred to the youth out in Texas or in Texas who were going to go party in El Paso, and they would refer to El Paso as Chuco. And so when they would say, "Hey, where are you going? ¿Dónde vas?" "Oh, voy Pachuco." So that kind of stuck, right? It's Pachuco. We're going to Chuco. So Pachucos, Pachucas are known as suitors. And the term Cholo is another term that was initially or originally a derogatory term. This was a way to degrade somebody, kind of call them a lowlife or a no good person, pretty much referring to them as a dog. It comes from the term Xoloscuintli, and which is the term for dog in Nahuatl, and also known as the breed of dogs, Xoloscuintli. But my understanding is that during the colonization of Mexico, the Spaniards created institutions that were known as prisons at the time, prisons or jails. And so the people that they had incarcerated there, kind of like calling them inmates, they would call them cholos, but as a way to, again, degrade them and dehumanize them. Again, that's another term that got reappropriated. It became another term of empowerment for a lot of people who are who were called or deemed cholos, right? It's kind of that mindset um, of creating chaos. If you're gonna call me a cholo, then I'm gonna be the baddest cholo, and so it's not very much, a term that is not necessarily derogatory. Yes, some people use it to demean others, but or to talk down to others, but for the most part, it's become this term of empowerment for those who are gang associated or involved. And so the last thing that I want to do is kind of talk about the stereotypes. And I want to focus on the positive stereotypes of any of the identity terms that you have heard, or when I reference Chicano culture, when I reference the lowrider scene, the lowrider culture. What are some of the positive stereotypes that you can think of, right? And I'll leave you with that question for you to ask yourself and to think about. And on the reverse side, I also want you to think about the negative stereotypes, because usually the negative stereotypes are easier to get to, easier to verbalize. But one thing that I want to caution you and that I want to also get you to think is about the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And that's this idea that somebody is bound to become whatever they're being called constantly, right? It becomes true for them. It becomes real for them. For example, for those that were often called cholos, no good people, low lives, but you constantly heard the term cholo being used against you. Eventually, you got to the point where you're like, okay, you're gonna call me cholo, then I'm gonna become the biggest cholo you know, or the baddest cholo you know, and therefore, kind of um, living up to that term, or how else can I say it? Kind of embodying that term, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes true for you. So I want to caution you, make sure that if you're a youngster out there that is constantly being told negative things, or you have negative terms being used against you, um, to be self-aware, to be conscious of what the impact could be for yourself, because nobody wants to see you being harmed or for you to harm no one else. And so be cautious with how you soak that in and how you live up to it. If you want to reach out to me, please do so. I'll be leaving you my contact information at the end of this video. I don't think I did my disclaimer at the beginning. I just want to let you know that all this information is information that I myself have researched. Different resources, different conversations. I've learned things along the way, and I was able to incorporate it into this presentation. I've done it for several years now at the Mecha Youth Conference, at the Docu Conference, and I've had the privilege of presenting it in Newman Auditorium, which is one of the first places where I got to hear a presentation at the JC as a student, as an 18-year-old, kind of fresh out of high school, not knowing what college was going to be like, or even if it was for me. I was there at a presentation regarding immigrant rights. And a couple years ago, I kind of came full circle, and I was able to present from that very first place that I got to hear a presentation. Not only that, I got to present on this topic. And so for me, it was more symbolic than anything. So again, this information is information that I myself have researched or learned about, and I incorporated into this presentation. I don't claim to know everything, and some of the information around the Chicano culture, the lowrider culture, can be difficult to obtain or hard to to capture. So if you are in the know of knowledge around this topic or these topics that I presented, if you have wisdom to share, please reach out to me. I welcome any and all wisdom and knowledge, and hopefully I can at some point incorporate it into this. My Instagram is at arte_por_ca. That's at arte_por_ca. And if you want to check out the work that I do with the youth here in our community in Santa Rosa, California, specifically in Roseland. You can check out my restorative page. That's Manny the Restorative. So on Instagram at Manny _the_ restorative. Keep an eye out for this visual presentation, and also the audio presentation that I've recorded for my podcast. It'll be available soon, and you can share it out. So I'll tag the link information on each presentation, and hopefully you all have easy access to it. All right. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I appreciate all y'all. Keep it forward. Siempre para adelante.